East Asian Studies and the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Harley Shaiken. I'm the chair of the Center for Latin American Studies, and we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event. But I have to admit, it was the Institute of East Asian Studies that inspired this event, and they certainly deserve credit for that, because I hope this is the first of many discussions that we have about the issues related to China and Latin America. Quite clearly, they are critical for many of the countries in Latin America. They are very important for China, and that alone makes them important for the United States and for much of the rest of the world. This is an important and evolving relationship with a lot of consequences and a lot of thorny issues ahead of us. We have not simply a distinguished panel, that sounds a little quiet, an insightful panel of people who have studied countries of this region or the region itself in terms of Latin America. And I'm going to introduce everyone at once. We have a very straightforward format. Each of the speakers will speak for 10 or 15 minutes. Then we'll have an informal discussion among the speakers, and then we will open it up for questions and comments from you. So we hope to begin defining some of these issues, looking at where we are today, and some of the directions the China-Latin America relationship might go. We're going to begin with Barry Eichengreen, who is the George C. and Helen N. Pardee Professor of Economics and a Professor of Political Science here at UC Berkeley. We will then go to Carol Wise, who is a professor at the University of Southern California. I should have mentioned that Barry Eichengreen will be focusing on what's happening in China and its possible implications for Latin America. Carol Wise will be starting with Latin America and looking at the relationship from that perspective. And then we are going to conclude with Margaret Myers, who is the director of the China-Latin America program, embodying both areas at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, and who has extensively traveled in and studied the region of in terms of Latin America and also China. So please join me in welcoming the panel, and then we'll begin with Barry.
Thank you, Harley. I don't know whether to begin with the standard disclaimer that I'm not a Latin American specialist, or with the standard disclaimer that I'm not a China specialist, but I think in combination that makes me the perfect person for this. Yeah. So, as an economist asked to think about economic implications of China's emergence from Latin America, one's immediately drawn to look at channels like these. How is Chinese export competition affecting Latin America? How much crowding out of Latin American exports by dynamic Chinese firms and inexpensive Chinese workers is occurring? Increasingly important is China's own demands for imports of commodities, raw materials, energy components, and increasingly final manufactured goods. And the question being how that is affecting the composition of Latin American exports, maybe to an extent shifting them away from manufacturers and toward commodities and energy, which not everyone would view as a desirable outcome. There is competition for foreign direct investment between China and Latin America. Lots of people talk about the possibility that foreign direct What about the trade diversion and the crowding out of exports? This figure, if it's visible, the big appropriately red bar on the right shows you the world market share of China and how that has risen enormously in the last 20 years. It's a reminder of that, that now famous phrase about how more sombreros are now being produced in China than in Mexico. I'm not sure that's still true given the reshoring of manufacturing to North America from China, but it kind of encapsulates the point and the worry. It's a point that I've studied with a co-author, who's now at the International Monetary Fund in this article, Fear of China. We look, we try to identify the impact on exports from other countries of China's competition. We do so kind of in a gravity model framework in which big countries trade more with one another than small countries. Countries that are close to one another trade more than countries that are far distant. And in that model, what we tend to find is, yes, indeed, China has been having a significant negative impact on exports of consumer goods from other countries, but a positive impact on exports of capital goods, commodities, and energy. So whether China's emergence and Chinese competitiveness is good or bad for you depends a lot on exactly who you are and exactly what it is you export. I think in this context, the question arises, how successful have Latin American countries been in moving out of the space where China has been hammering the foreign competition? We look in the same paper at the diversion of foreign direct investment flows, and again at the question of whether potential Latin American recipients of FDI are being crowded out. So here again, the framework is kind of the standard gravity model workhorse that economists use to analyze these kind of international flows. Here in this case, there'll be larger investment flows between big countries and small ones, larger investment flows between countries that are in some sense close to one another and countries that are far apart. We found little evidence of FDI diversion overall, that cases where a given source country was sending more direct foreign investment to China, it was sending less to an alternative destination. But then we went on in this case to distinguish recipients not according to the commodity composition of production or trade, but rather by geography and, if you will, stage of economic development. So what we found here was that the overall result that there didn't seem to be evidence of significant FDI diversion from other countries toward China was disguising very different effects in different parts of the world. There was significant FDI diversion from advanced OECD economies. China was able to attract more foreign direct investment associated with the growth of its manufacturing sector at the expense of those other OECD countries. In Asia itself, in contrast, it seems like what dominates are regional supply chains and production networks, that where China is attracting foreign direct investment for its assembly operations, other economies in the region are at the same time, as a result, able to attract more foreign direct investment for the production of parts, components, the things that go into China's assembly operations. And again, Latin America here seems to be the outlier in that there's evidence neither of a positive or negative FDI diversion effect on balance. And finally, this figure is a reminder of the fact that China course, includes China's outward investment in resource-related sectors in Latin American countries, something that I emphasize here for my non-economist colleagues, that we economists would regard as strongly positive, the fact that China is engaged in all this FDI in Latin America, assuming that problems with labor standards, problems with environment are adequately addressed. So in my remaining 5 minutes or so, let me speculate for a moment about how the future is likely to differ from the immediate past. The Chinese economy itself is not only growing, but changing in structure quite rapidly, and I think those changes in structure will have implications for other regions like Latin America. So there is a rebalancing away from investment toward consumption going on in China. The red bars here are the contributions to growth from consumption. What share of total Chinese growth is accounted for by consumption as opposed to investment or net exports? And you can see that the red bars have recently been the largest single element. The crisis year 2009 being a big outlier when the government ramped up investment. Retail sales are now growing in China at 13% or more, half again as fast as the economy as a whole. And I think the question for this audience and this panel is whether Latin America can take advantage of this change in structure. So the question is, what will Chinese consumers be buying? If you can make out the figures on the right, they remind you that Chinese consumers are buying automobiles big time, and to the extent they're not being produced in China itself, they are certainly not being produced in Latin America. They're coming from, or for that matter, the United States. They're coming from Europe. Consumer electronics in the middle panel, and of course services on the far right. Another take on the same thing appears here. After buying cars, Chinese middle-class consumers are buying prestige goods, branded luxury products, home furnishings, and the companies that are expanding rapidly in the Chinese market have familiar names like Armani and Hugo Boss, which I guess are not Latin American names. So again, the question is, to what extent can the region's economies take advantage of what will be for some time now the most rapidly growing consumer market in the world. The other thing I would emphasize is, while the consumer market will grow and while the Chinese market will grow, it will not grow in the future at the same speed that it's grown in the recent past. The simplest way of understanding that is in terms of the fact that Chinese population, and especially Chinese labor force, will not grow at the same pace in the future than it has in the past. So demography is not destiny, but demography does shape economic outcomes, and the legacy of the one-child policy will shape economic outcomes in China now, I think, quite powerfully. One iron law of economics is that all fast-growing economies slow down eventually. No country in the history of the world has or will grow at double-digit rates forever. So if you look at a large sample of fast-growing economies, as I did with my co-authors in this paper, we asked at what income levels do fast-growing economies typically slow down, and what we found is that slowdowns from fast growth typically occur in steps, like a staircase with 2 steps on it. The first slowdown occurs at a level of per capita income that China reached about 2 years ago, depending on of statistics, and indeed the Chinese economy has slowed from a 10+% growth rate to now something in the range of 8%. The second slowdown typically occurs at a level of per capita income that China will reach in 3 or so more years if everything goes according to plan, at which point the growth rate would typically slow down by another 2 or 3 percentage points. So I think China is going to remain a dynamic economy. I'm not one of those people who catastrophizes about China's economic future, but the growth of the Chinese economy, I think the growth of its retail market will slow somewhat, and the growth of its demands for commodities, energy, and the like exported from Latin America, among other regions, will now tend to slow as well. So let me stop there.
Well, let me just thank both the centers, East Asian Studies and Latin American Studies, for this invitation. Just love Berkeley so much. It's just putting me in such a good mood being here. Even though the weather is exactly the same in Los Angeles. The air is clear, the colors seem brighter. It's just really fabulous to be here. Thank you. I didn't expect such a huge turnout here. All right, so this was such a great setup, a great presentation to try and go into more detail here. It's a key question what these Latin American countries are going to be able to export to China, right? And I'm going to talk about free trade agreements that have been formed between 2 South American countries with China. As you can see from the title here, Chile and Peru signed independent agreements. And certainly these agreements were signed with the idea precisely of exporting more, if you will, higher value-added goods, getting away from the consumer and maybe into some of their own electronics and metal mechanics and this kind of thing. And they certainly went into these with an eye toward increasing Chinese foreign direct investment in the economy, but outside of mining and commodities, because it's been almost 99.9% concentrated in commodities. So let's just begin with brief statements and brief introductions about a free trade agreement. It's when both parties agree to drop the border over time, usually within a 10-year period, for goods, capital, not people, although in the California-Mexico situation we have plenty of people flows, which I think is a result of the North American Free Trade Agreement. But it's basically about goods, investment, and capital, other kinds of capital flows. So what we've seen is this interesting pattern ever since the North American Free Trade Agreement was negotiated with Mexico going in with 2 developed countries. Almost all of the free trade agreements we've seen, say since the 90s, tend to be North-South agreements, right? I mean, the U.S. has signed so many agreements with Latin American countries. I think at last count it's got 13 now. Just finished Colombia and Panama. It's got agreements with Peru and Chile and whatnot. And we do have some, forward here, we do have some South-South agreements. Yes. We do have some South-South agreements, and those tend to be, for example, the Southern Cone Common Market, which is Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. So what we haven't seen is what we're looking at now, which is, according to World Trade Organization classifications, certainly these agreements are classified as South-South agreements. That is to say, the China-Peru agreement and exporting back, mainly industrial goods. So it is a South-South technical classification, but it's a North-South pattern of trade. So why does that matter? Well, it mattered certainly in terms of the expectations of the demandeurs in both Chile and Peru, the ones that requested this agreement with China. I've talked to the lead negotiator on the free trade agreement negotiating team in both Peru and Chile, and they really thought that this was going to break it open. And these are really qualified economists, right? This was really going to kind of give them the opportunity to break out of this sort of very traditional, old-fashioned comparative advantage relationship. So the disappointments are there with regard to both, even though we're really early in the game, right? This is very early in the game. So both of these agreements also cover, obviously they cover the old trade agenda, market access, agriculture, this kind of thing. But there are new trade agenda items covered in these agreements, which would be investment, services, unfortunately things that these data show that Latin America hasn't really been able to penetrate with regard to attracting FDI from China or trading services back and forth with China. So even though the agreements cover old and new trade agenda, as we've been calling them, the fact is that they're mainly about the old trade agenda. So let's just go to three theories, or three prominent ideas, if you will. They haven't nailed down an explanation. But let's go to three of the kind of either most current or most convincing explanations for why these free trade agreements come about. The most comprehensive one, I'm kind of, well, they did publish this in the journal Politics by Shaiken and Berkeley. These two brilliant young Princeton new professors that have books coming out at Oxford next year on this. I was honored to review it. And they argued that these free trade agreements are basically a strategy to internationalize the challenges of economic liberalization and signal a legally binding reform commitment. Am I there? Yes, I'm there. And I think that really is about where it stands, all right? However, I want to emphasize that that really is about North-South free trade agreements in the sort of literal sense, and not this kind of North-South dynamic between China and these countries occurring, under a South-South classification. The other explanation, classic Mansfield and Milner, it's been published in a book, it's been followed up by Chase in the International Organization article, Shadlin, Journal of Economic Studies, and these are the arguments that talk about the kinds of lobbies that form across the border in terms of cross-border trade, cross-border production. This is, I think, one of the best explanations for the North American Free Trade Agreement, and, if you will, the anxiety and the real enthusiasm for producers on both sides of the Mexican-U.S. border that are operating in all of the really dynamic sectors that we're now seeing coming back to life. Aviation equipment, medical equipment, high tech, all over the place, this kind of thing. So the cross-border production intra-industry trade explanation can be penetrating. There's no cross-border production, really, or intra-industry trade occurring between these countries and China, all right? I've already described the relationship. And then the other explanation, a book by Mark Manger, came out of Cambridge 3 years ago, is that the free trade agreements are basically a way to institutionalize efforts on the part of investors, mainly northern investors, that are looking for both market and efficiency-seeking investments. And the way I've described it, the other kind of investment is resource-seeking, and the Chinese interest in Latin America, and it's mainly in South America, Mexico and Central America, the odd ones out. We can talk more about that in the Q&A of the discussion. But we have seen resource-seeking investments really like we've never seen in the Latin American region with regard to billions of dollars that China direction nor investment opportunities characterize this. And we can also talk more about my first point here, which is that signaling a legally binding reform commitment is not exactly, and it has to be on both sides, right? And I submit to you that none of these countries could really count on China with the sort of political, economic behavior that we've seen thus far to uphold any kind of legally binding reform commitment, right? Very untransparent financial sector. They have gotten with the rules of, international norms and whatnot. They belong to the World Trade Organization, but they also do exactly what they want to do, particularly with other developing countries like small open economies in South America. Okay, so let's look at reasons for China's success with these FTAs. And I mean success in simply negotiating them, right? And, I've also been able to talk modestly, given I have no Mandarin, but I was invited to Peking University to a wonderful event that tried to look at some of China's interest in this going out, whatever it is, strategy, and I was able to, get some conversation going about why are they accepting the invitation to negotiate these free trade agreements with these Latin American countries. And the answers are so fascinating to me. Well, they're worried about losing market share because everybody else is negotiating a free trade agreement, so they want to jump on the bandwagon. Well, these markets are so small compared to Chinese gross domestic product, and the share is minuscule. However, the resources are not. All right, Chile, I believe now, is at least the first or second copper producer and exporter in the world. So, they have sort of learned some of the jargon of international political economy. They want to be on the bandwagon. They don't want to be left out of markets. Let's look though for other reasons for success. For example, I don't see Brazil or Argentina or Mexico going to Beijing and requesting negotiation of a free trade agreement with China. Why? Because these are countries with very big domestic lobbies and domestic interests in big industrial sectors, right? And there's just no way that they could domestically, in terms of the politics and the political economy, come together, not right now at least. So Brazil, Mexico, Argentina really aren't looking for such agreements. But Peru and Chile thought it would be a way to, as I said, diversify exports to China and attract more non-resource or non-mining free trade agreement. So I'm going to go very quickly here. I just have 3 more slides because I do think so many people here, we want time for Q&A. Let's look at what's in this for China. You have to spend some time and some diplomatic capital, or if you will, political capital, negotiating these agreements. And let me just say, these agreements came together very quickly, all right? It wasn't some year and a half, round after round like we saw with the North American Free Trade Agreement. I think there were 4 meetings between the Peruvians, and the Chileans, I think, were able to nail this down in 6 months. But as the Chinese see it, they've contractualized a relationship that is really suiting them, which is they're buying the primary goods that they need, and they are exporting manufactured goods back to these countries. I'll say more about that in a moment. So also, it's interesting, the big complainers, the big anti-dumping complaints are obviously coming from Mexico and Brazil with regard to China and have the World Trade Organization. I have to say that just by virtue of signing these agreements with Chile and with Peru, we've seen less conflict between the Chinese government and these 2 countries, but we're going to look at that in just a moment. The Chinese also really obviously on everybody's minds, OECD, emerging markets, everybody wants in with that higher consumption. Everybody wants to be selling more to the Chinese market. And certainly Chile has not been selling anything more. They don't have really, as Barry said, the luxury brands or whatnot. Now here's the other side of this though. The Chinese agreed to just duty-free entry for 50% of their exports to Chile. And they agreed to exclude so-called sensitive products, shoes, appliances, agricultural exports. These are huge on the Chilean side, right? Small industrial sector, small open economy, etc. So the Chilean government and the trade team were able to tout this as a big victory, right? We kept China out of the market. We mitigated some of this stress and this competition. And look at, we got nearly 100% access immediately. Peru, it's the same thing. 99% access immediately for all Peruvian exports, copper, gold, tin, all of them, but for the most part, they're only selling primary goods. Duty-free entry for only 68% of imports from China, and 592 products kept off, off the table. So, just let me finish. I've seen my time card. Let me say that what I think surprised me most about this, I'm not surprised that the Chinese were willing to accept these restricted goods and sensitive products and all sorts of new restrictions getting into these markets, because these markets are trivial for them, right? But these are two countries that have really made their claim to free trade, liberal economic agenda, and whatnot. And I'm sorry, but these protections in these industrial sectors, this is sort of what I would call a backdoor industrial policy, or sneaky managed trade, where they're able to turn around and tout this as a big victory, but in fact, they're closing up the domestic market with regard to China and mitigating conflict, and the Chinese are right there with them, helping them out. So, let me just, my very last words, did Peru and Chile really need these free trade agreements? No, they did not. I think that they were expecting, and both will, with hindsight, admit that they were naive on this, both were expecting that this would be a flood of investment from other emerging markets. This would indeed signal something brand new is going on in the region. And in fact, what they got is a kind of, as I said, implicit agreement with their own domestic sector that they're going to look out for them, and an explicit agreement from the Chinese that they're willing to accept, quite frankly, protectionist barriers to some of these goods because they really mean so little to the Chinese. This question, and this is the last one, this question of exporting to China, most Latin American countries are obsessed with it, right? How can we export more? Oh, what are we going to do? Oh, look what's happening. And I've been interviewing people in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Colombia, a whole project on this, and the answer is you're not going to probably. There's a long line of countries, emerging markets, OECD, that want into that Chinese market. And I think that given the amount of reform that's occurred in this region, very positive, especially macroeconomic stability and whatnot, I think it's really a better focus for them to look at the world, look at the region. We've seen a big explosion of trade between the countries in the region, and that's continuing to grow. So, I think this particular group of countries, forget about exporting to China. Even if, the per capita income does go up and we're going to see more consumption, it isn't going to be consumption of the goods that these countries have been producing. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here as well, so thank you very much to the East Asian Studies and Latin American Studies Centers for the kind invitation. At the risk of sort of restating what you've already heard, I'll simply outline, first of all, some of the fundamentals of the China-Latin American relationship. So I'm not sure that this is my first slide. There we go. So as you've heard, it's a trade-based relationship. often imbalanced, we've talked about this as well, with Latin America exporting primarily raw materials and agricultural commodities and importing increasingly high-tech industrialized goods. We're seeing more cars, we're seeing more cell phones. It used to be, plastic buckets and things like this. Now it's much more high-tech. And of note is that the vast majority of Chinese trade and other financial engagement, we're talking lending and investment, takes place in just a handful of countries, right? So we have Brazil, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Ecuador, and increasingly now Colombia. And so you'll see kind of the group of countries that are really active in terms of trade here and what they're trading, which is primarily or exporting, which is primarily commodities. Same sort of deal here. This is a breakdown by percentage. Again, commodities exports. And then some bilateral trade figures. And you can see again, it's this handful of countries that are participating. And it seems evident that China will maintain this same sort of trade and resource-based relationship with the region for the time being, and we've discussed this as well. So what I'd like to focus on are three sort of trends that, while unlikely to change these fundamental dynamics of the relationship, appear to be slightly altering China's means of approaching or interacting with Latin America. As we attempt to determine what the China-Latin America relationship will look like moving forward, it's very important, I think, to take a look at the behavior of China's firms, lending institutions, and government sort of entities that are operating in Latin America, and how this behavior appears to be evolving. So this brings me to my first sort of point or trend, which I can figure this out. I think we are seeing a very interesting professionalization and internationalization process taking place among China's overseas entities. So there are several ways in which Chinese overseas actors tend to sort of stand out from their international counterparts. They prefer to make deals by means of direct sort of government-to-government or leader-to-leader negotiations. They have a propensity for involvement in some very risky countries, Venezuela, for example, in Latin America, but also Libya, Burma, and the list goes on. They approach aid quite a bit differently. And they come to the table with the promise of low-interest financing from China's major policy banks, which some say gives them an unfair advantage in negotiations. Then there are a variety of other reasons, or ways in which they differ from their international counterparts as well. But in terms of environmental and labor standards, there is compelling evidence that Chinese entities are generally operating on par with their foreign counterparts. And this is not something that we generally expect from China, given a lot of the press that's been out there on sort of Chinese behavior in terms of labor and environmental standards in the region, and also in Africa. And I think Africa and Latin America are very different cases, too, so talking about Latin America specifically. A study was done fairly recently by Carol's and my colleagues, Kevin Gallagher and Amos Irwin, looking at the behavior of one of China's most notorious firms in Latin America. It's called Shaiken. You can see them protesting against Shaiken right here. And it operates a copper mine in Totomocho, Peru. And they discovered that even this most despised of Chinese firms abides by local labor and environmental stipulations as often, and sometimes even more, than U.S., Canadian, and other international sort of counterparts. Chinese firms are also increasingly employing local or Western CEOs to make their sort of companies more approachable in the region. They're abiding increasingly by higher content stipulations in certain agreements. And they are employing big advertising, legal, and public affairs firms to advise on local markets. And this is not something that they did, 10 years ago when they first arrived in the region. This whole professionalization process, I don't think should come as a major surprise. It's something that should be expected as China becomes more adept at operating internationally. But it nonetheless has very important implications for the way in which Chinese firms act in the region and the way in which they are perceived. The second point, or development, is somewhat related. And it involves a growing number of references in Chinese literature to the benefits of transparency in overseas engagement. And some of the sinologists in here, I don't know if you're surprised by that or not, but I was. And as I mentioned China has preferred to directly engage certain governments and individual leaders. So direct, behind closed door sort of dealings with Hugo Chavez or Gaddafi or whomever have sped along major investments and projects in their respective countries. Problems arise, however, when China's friends abroad fall from power. And we're seeing this happen right now in Venezuela as a result of Chavez's health issues. The Chinese are very concerned that political uncertainty in sort of post-Chavez Venezuela could threaten established agreements. So now, to make overseas agreements or deals more viable, in spite of political change, some in China are calling for greater transparency in cooperative agreements. An article last month posted in all places on the China National Petroleum Corporation website calls for greater transparency and information dissemination, first of all, to strengthen the legal basis for Chinese overseas agreements, and to promote favorable public opinion in foreign countries. Another, from the Ministry of Commerce, calls for improvements in the corporate image of Chinese firms, and says that opacity in Chinese deal-making is an impediment for greater overseas engagement. And there are plenty more examples where those came from. Certainly, this commitment to overseas transparency is very much in its infancy. But if China's overseas entities see increasing benefit in conforming to international standards, I think it's possible that progress toward transparency abroad could potentially outpace Beijing's efforts at home. The third trend that I'll mention is a growing commitment from China to development-related agreements with Latin American regional organizations. And the most notable, I think, especially in China, this is talked about all of the time in China, is a meeting that took place about a year ago between Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, which is in Santiago, Chile. In this meeting, China promised $5 billion to develop manufacturing in strategic sectors in the region. It also promised a credit line of $10 billion to boost infrastructure cooperation with Bank of China. It proposed new intergovernmental consultation mechanisms and cooperation in any number of areas, right? Food security, innovation, science and technology, climate change, sustainable development, you name it. It's now also working with the Inter-American Development Bank, and I think this is very interesting, to approve a new private equity fund that will focus investment on specific economic sectors in Latin America. It's valued right now at, there are 3 different funds valued altogether at $1.8 billion, but there are rumors it will be increased to $5 billion to match what Wen Jiabao said at that meeting at ECLAC. And that's a lot. This sort of engagement by China is fairly new in Latin America. We've seen some similar sort of things in Africa, but it's new in Latin America, and it's really intended to demonstrate China's commitment to Latin American development and to promote this sort of long-term relationship building. And this is something the Chinese talk about a lot, especially within the sort of foreign affairs apparatus, about how important it is to be able to develop long-term relationships in the region and what they need to do to make that happen. I'll conclude by saying that despite some signs that the China-Latin America relationship is maturing, there remains a huge gap in mutual understanding that continues to impede progress. College-age students and younger, right, in certain countries in Latin America and in China are increasingly studying each other's languages and cultures and societies. So there is evidently, quite a bit of progress, but expertise in academia, within companies and among decision makers in the Chinese government and Latin American governments is really lacking on both sides. And this is something that the Chinese in particular will readily admit. There have been many efforts of late to close this gap through educational exchange at all levels and in all sectors. But a sort of generational expertise lag is in play at the moment. And it really is impeding effective decision making on both sides, and has led, arguably, I think, to excessive risk-taking on the part of Chinese, and to difficulty seizing economic opportunity, as was mentioned earlier, on of China to balance trade and regional development, but this knowledge gap is ever present. I have plenty of anecdotes that I could share with you later on if you like, and continues to impede progress between the two regions. It really does, along with some other sort of impeding factors. There are, of course, in addition to the sort of the three I've mentioned, many other factors influencing the China-Latin America economic relationship and political relationship, including China's very complex plans for domestic economic reform, which were mentioned, its sort of global political ambitions, its interest in financial liberalization, and so on. There are any number of factors that kind of influence the way it relates with each specific country. But these are three developments that I personally find very interesting and worthy of attention in the coming year that kind of move me excited. So, thank you.
What I'd like to do now, I have two, do I need this? I guess I do. Thank you. I'd like to ask two brief questions for everyone on the panel, and then ask if anyone on the panel has a question for someone else. And then after that, we will open it up to comments and discussion. The two brief questions coming out of these three, I think, very thoughtful presentations that really covered a lot of ground. The first related to geopolitics, the second related to competitiveness between China and the manufacturing exporters of Latin America, principally Mexico and Brazil, in the future. On the geopolitics, this comes from a dinner I had 5 years ago in Southern California at the University of Southern California.
Better not be used to
No, it's the one you're familiar with. And with Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the former president of Brazil. And this was at a point when the relationship was really flourishing. There was, he was no longer president, to be sure, but there was a lot of Chinese investment in Brazil. So my question to him was, do you feel potentially threatened by competitiveness with China? That is there another side to the benefits that you're seeing today? And he really said, instead, no, we feel very good about the relationship. It's a counterbalance to U.S. power in the region, in exactly those terms. And I found that sort of a fascinating response. So any comments on geopolitics is the first question. And the second is this competitiveness in manufacturing. And I think there's two dimensions to this. One is, in a country like Brazil, where you have Embraer, the commercial aircraft manufacturer, is one of the central exporters of the country. China's moving very rapidly and aggressively into this very market where they will be direct competitors. What happens to the relationship in other areas as this evolves? The second dimension of this is Chinese firms investing in Chinese-owned production facilities in Mexico and Brazil and Latin America that compete directly with other industries in these countries. For example, Chinese automakers, which currently are often in joint ventures in China, are clearly moving to independent exporting from China. It's in its infancy, but will also, I think, with little question, be setting up production facilities in their own name in Latin America, for Latin America and for export to the U.S. To what extent is that a meaningful issue that would create tension between China and Latin America? So those two questions, one on geopolitics, one on competitive coalition. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I'm in international relations. I'll say something about geopolitics. It's interesting because that was 5 years ago, right?
Yes.
And so now, I mean, certainly there's still very palpable anti-Americanism in the region, and it's been worse since we got, the Bush administration. China's just mowing over, some of these industrial sectors, and they don't feel so good about that. So, yes, I think it's equal, different clauses of animosity, but it's been very difficult. You really do see a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment now. Not well founded, but you hear it and you see it. Want to talk about this?
Sure. So I think it's quite right that companies like Embraer, which is a big Brazilian success story, do have to worry about Chinese competition coming. I'm a strong believer that the world is not flat, and that geography is very important. The one reason that Mexico is doing well and moving into manufacturing at the moment is it's close to a big market, namely ours. So it has a durable advantage over China in that time to market, ability to adjust production and deliver very quickly is much easier for Mexico if you're talking about the U.S. market than for China. Harley alluded to the possibility that China will attempt to circumvent this obstacle by when we see more and more of its companies investing directly in the manufacturing sectors of Mexico or conceivably Brazil and conceivably other Latin American countries. Again, a point with which I agree, but then you went on and suggested that this could be a source of tension between China and the Latin American countries, where I would say to the contrary, to the extent that the aspiration of Latin American polities is to develop manufacturing, to become very diversified, to rely less on exports of minerals and raw materials and the like. Chinese foreign direct investment in manufacturing should be a source of harmony.
showed me a new soccer stadium, a new Chinatown that just opened, that is 3 blocks of all these, you know, Christmas ornaments and things that, you know, the toys and all of that, the old sort of cheap stuff. And a couple of other things that they got, but I had a student do a content analysis, you know, carefully going over the run-up and time during the negotiations and afterwards, because it's really thickly in the press in these other countries where we've had free trade agreements, and even Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and so little debate, so little anything. So I've got to dig deeper. I've got to get into these industrial parks where this is the only country that has been, because of Intel and all these other, you know, technological companies that have come into Costa Rica since the 90s. This is the only country that's exporting high value-added goods to China, and that is an interesting story. But I haven't cracked the code yet.
Any other questions from the panel?
Well, I have a question for our resident economist. I was in Mexico in early December, and the Mexicans don't see it. Well, of course, they're happy that manufacturing is coming back to Mexico. I mean, it shouldn't have left in the first place. But what we see is that one of the reasons is that China's per capita income is on the rise, and quite frankly, Mexico's has plateaued. If you look at the figures, there's just no pulse since 2000, right? It's just flat. And that's not a very good reason for, you know, I mean, the Mexicans had hoped that the companies would be coming back because there's higher skilled people, and it's a more dynamic place, etc. And if it's mainly about wages, which this is largely sort of economic press in Mexico and debate and whatnot, if it's largely about, you know, Mexico having the cheaper wages and not climbing up, you know, that much higher on the so-called, you know, industrial learning curve or whatnot, is that successful?
You've been to Mexico more recently than I have, so I should restrain the temptation to answer. But
Don't do that.
but really, as you say, some of the chatter about Mexico is that labor costs have been going up quite sharply in China, in Chinese manufacturing, in big companies like Foxconn. But I think, as I said before, the Mexican case has a lot to do with proximity to the U.S. market, and with how manufacturing supply chains and the like are changing. That speed of response and ability to change the product mix and deliver quickly are important. You don't have to put the goods in a container ship to get them from Mexico to the United States, and that is important as well.
I'd like to briefly follow up on what Barry just said, because I think in response to your question, I think it's a very important issue that we sometimes lose sight of. There's such a focus on the labor cost. Clearly it's critical, but let's look at an industry such as auto. To assemble a medium-sized automobile takes about 20 labor hours. So if it's $5 an hour in Mexico, which would be the total compensation cost, that'd be $100 in assembly cost. If it's $3 an hour in China, you would be saving $40. Now that's significant, but it costs roughly $500 to ship a vehicle. So geography really does matter, and the differences in labor cost alone are not what is going to define investment. It is the combination of labor cost, productivity, quality, and transportation cost. As the price of oil goes up, transportation costs go up. At best, it's unstable. So there are a lot of issues here beyond labor costs. So with that comment, are there any questions or comments?
Yeah.
And do we need to pass this? I think we need to pass this.
So my question goes to something, when government-to-government treaties, such as the ones you've been describing, are usually done, the backbone of them in a lot of other places in the the world are sovereign guarantees for trade transactions. So in effect, KFW, FMO, IFC, Exim, they all essentially guarantee transactions in those countries with private enterprises. How has these trade agreements created the circumstances for trade guarantees between China and those countries?
Sure, if you prefer.
Yeah, just looking.
Okay, we'll take a group of questions and then answer them. You take
Yeah, I spent some time in NAFTA for 12 years, and I have a real problem with free trade. I think you should call it fair trade until the Chinese float their currency. The Chinese and the Asians, I've worked with them, are masters of manipulating their currency, protecting their markets, picking the industries they want to support, giving cheap capital. And you can check with the Mexicans, because I used to go down there every 6 weeks. They got screwed because of the WTO agreement by manipulating their currency. And I really believe that now China can't compete on quality and transportation in our kind of markets, so they're going down and buying the raw materials. And I think when they find out what the Chinese are going to do in those economies, they never live up to their agreements, the Asians, until you beat them and beat them to death. So I really want your opinion on that.
one more question.
Thanks. I work in Peru and Brazil, and I have been traveling on the interoceanic road, that main artery that runs from the Brazilian coast to the Peruvian coast, specifically looking at the trade of people and things along the road. And I was curious about China's involvement because there are so many, particularly on the Peruvian side, there are so many rumors about who has funded this road and how, and it's generally pointed on the Brazilians. And as I was seen as Brazilian, it was generally a negative thing. Peruvians felt not ready for the development, and that it was benefiting the Brazilians over the Peruvians. And so I was curious about what, if at all, how does that funding work? It's much more apparent in the Chilean segment of the road, because it's just been much more visible, the China's involvement in investment. And then another question I had was, one that I'm blanking on right now, but it had to do with, I guess, a bit more of what kinds of cooperation is happening, I guess, in the tri-frontier area, if there's any kind of knowledge you guys about that.
The microphone is here. I can take the only one that really falls within my expertise is the question about the currency. It's not something that I work on specifically, but I know the people who do. And I think the complaint you voice about the currency is an old one that is no longer accurate. So I see you shaking your head. And
How much has it changed in the last 3 years? It's only gone up about 5%. When the Japanese yen was at 240 to the dollar, about 15, 20 years ago when it went in the auto industry, it was 3 times cheaper.
So what one should look at when one asks whether a currency is fairly valued or not is not only the nominal exchange rate, but also what is happening to the internal price level at the level of costs in the respective economies. One should look at the real exchange rate adjusted for inflation in China, which is running much higher than inflation in the United States, and for wage costs, which are rising much more quickly in China than the United States. It is a hoary old complaint that no longer, I think, has validity. There are many problems between China and other countries, but fortunately for all of us, the currency is no longer one of them.
Well, I can speak to this gentleman's aspect of free trade versus fair trade because I'm sorry if I gave the impression that NAFTA is really free trade. I mean, jokingly we're calling it the North American Auto Agreement, right?
Right.
So, and you know, you still have these huge rules of origin and all these messy, I mean, it's all about what you can't do, not what you can do, right? So,
produced in
I mean, it's a form of managed trade. It was sort of more elegantly done than these overt just exceptions and restrictions in these South American markets. But I would submit, let me put this on the table, now don't get mad. I would submit that these content requirements are what led to this debacle with the auto industry, quite frankly. They coddled themselves, they didn't restructure, they're supposed to restructure. They really didn't keep their eye on, trends, market trends, and demand for alternative energy cars and this sort of thing. And I think that, the rules of origin are also still up in textiles and still up in computer equipment. And I don't think that's been good for Mexico at all. I think that we would have seen much more investment coming in there. The Chinese are trying to get in there into the auto sector. They're willing to just like lay down the plant and just produce. But this gets into more kind of cultural or sociological aspects of negotiating. Both sides just threw in the towel and walked away because the Chinese just expected that the Mexican government would be financing, subsidizing the finance for a lot of this operation because that's what they do. And the Mexicans wanted real interest rates on real terms and insisting on co-financing. So, there's all kinds of barriers that have been up, not just in Mexico, also Brazil, even in understanding in terms of getting, investment in there in a productive way. So it isn't even fair trade, right? It's distorted trade, quite frankly. I can take a couple of these other questions and then I'll turn the mic to Margaret. There's this point made about the interoceanic road. Somebody just sent me an entire edited collection in Spanish on that road. Yeah, everything you want to know about the road, because it's actually two separate roads. It's one that goes from Brazil to Peru, and then there's another one that cuts through Chile at the bottom, right? And it's really interesting because when the free trade agreement with the Americas was still alive in the negotiation, the announcement in '94, and the OAS and the IDB and the World Bank and USAID and the Europeans, everybody's in there. And that's where the road comes from. The Chinese really didn't invest in that road, but what they have done is take amazing advantage of it to get their soybeans out of the Amazon and into the ports. The Peruvians have now, I spent a month there last year, and they have launched 11 new ports. It's all concessions, like the Port of Dubai and whatnot. It's all concessions, but 11 new ports just to get all this commerce out of Brazil, through the road, and into China and Asia, quite frankly. So the roads, the infrastructure has made quite a difference in Peru. Two-way trade between Peru and Brazil is really great now, and I think in a very positive way. I think that's, something about government to government. Trade's not the problem, investment's the problem, right? I mean, trade, you can litigate in the WTO, and by virtue of signing these free trade agreements with two small open economies, the Chinese have really mitigated a lot of conflict because, they're not going to take, Peru's not going to take China to the WTO. It's expensive, it's burdensome, and besides, you're getting a lot of money from commodities, so they're heavy. Investment is a problem, like you're saying. There's at least 3 or 4 entities that are supposed to rule over investment disputes, and it is understood that both sides to the treaty are going to uphold those investment guarantees, right? And I have seen such a huge leap forward in terms of small countries like Peru, Chile, Colombia upholding those investment terms. But China is a loose cannon, right? If put to the test, if really put to the test, are they going to really uphold the terms of those investments? And that is, I think, one of the first points I made there about a legally binding commitment. Most times when we go into these free trade agreements, they're really about investment and trade. And the idea is that you are nailing down a contract, right? And I think these countries realize, they didn't want to really smell the coffee in the beginning, but I mean, they're looking at it now and thinking, what did we get out of this? What did we get? We got some exceptions in our domestic market. They're not hammering us like they used to, but this is still really tough. And, they're not getting investment. So I think the investment disputes are going to be interesting. interesting, and there's so many that can rise, let me tell you. But let me pass this to Margaret.
Speaking of tangents here, I don't know nearly as much about them interoceanic road as Carol does, but if you're interested in kind of infrastructure-related lending and how that sort of happens in Latin America, we're actually about to post a database, sort of tool on our website where you can search all of the loans by lender and type and year from 2005 to 2012, and that may be, it doesn't sound like that was a loan-related deal.
My question is going directly.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was then this database should hopefully be helpful in that respect. But what generally happens in these cases with these loans is that a company will approach a policy bank. Usually it's China Exim Bank or the China Development Bank with a project, and they will partner. At that point, the development bank, the policy bank establishes an interest rate, puts together a package, and the negotiations begin, and content stipulations are usually made by the country itself where the project is being done. So that's kind of the way that most of these sort of lending schemes can work, and it's the same in Africa as well. And so you see that kind of across the board. I'm sorry, I was thinking that yours was a bit more related to sort of free trade agreements, and so I was directed to Carol.
The backbone of a lot of trade agreements are the sovereign guarantees that are transferred to private transactions. So the classic example would be somebody wants to build a new refinery. The debt of the refinery is then made a sovereign debt, and that is guaranteed by IFC in the United States or KfW in Germany and so on. And that allows a private construction company, usually if it's German, it'd be KfW, if it's US, it'd be Bechtel, and so on, to do the construction of the building. And the question is, are the Chinese doing the same kinds of things as a result of these trade agreements?
No, I was just going to actually comment. Okay, well, you know what? They're basically just lending out a lot of money regardless of whether or not you're in this free trade agreement. So, and it's not very sophisticated. Margaret knows more about that than I do, but we have a colleague that wrote a great paper on this. But the other side, that's another interesting thing, is they gave $10 million to Venezuela for a currency swap, but 10 to Argentina. Well, these are not reliable countries at the moment, right? And I think it's going to be really interesting when those bills start coming due and China's not going to be paid, certainly not by Argentina anytime soon, right? And probably not Venezuela. So, you know, there's so many thorny issues. Right now we're in the honeymoon period, right? But it can start getting really thorny.
Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. We can take one more round if it's very quick, and we'll take 2 questions here and here, and then I'd ask for brief answers.
Let's see, in one of the books there, I was reading Asian Survey on the 5th floor. It was a DVD called Manufactured Landscapes, and I was really taken back. It was on shipbuilding, and it showed all the piles and piles and just rivers and oceans of cell phones out there, and so their landscape was completely 100% manufactured with nothing but dump and junk and garbage, and it was all cell phones. And it was a really, really good DVD if you ever get a chance to see it, from the Ashby Library or the Walnut Creek Library. It's called Manufactured Landscapes, and they show the shipbuilding, and you know, like they have over at the Alameda College where the Navy Yard is. They showed the Navy Yard and the ships and then the cell phones.
And one more, and this will be our final question, and then we can brief the responses.
Thanks to all the speakers for a very informative set of presentations. One thing that I'm very curious about when we're talking about the increased volume of China's overseas loans, FDI, and aid, is that we're not talking about the cosmopolitan composition of Chinese capital and the fact that a significant percentage of it is in fact composed of bond lending from overseas banks, and we're talking about Paris France, Citigroup, and Barclays, and that sort of thing. Although the percentage has declined significantly over the past couple of years, that cosmopolitan capital is still present. And I guess my question for you is, does this matter?
I'm not sure. It's not a phenomenon I've looked at. It's not one that I'm terribly familiar with. These are foreign financial institutions, I infer, that are doing business with China on China's behalf via Hong Kong. They're primarily Hong Kong based at this point rather than onshore. China makes use of expertise where it can find it, and if it finds it in a foreign investment bank, then so be it.
Any other comments?
That's very important and certainly something to look into. It's not something we know a tremendous amount about. I mean, the loans that we look at, the major sort of loans that are billions of dollars in loans, are coming from, 80% are coming from China Exim and China Development Bank. Then you also have a little bit of ICBC and a few other sort of smaller banks, but they tend to be, banks that are affiliated fully with the Chinese government, and they're not these sort of cosmopolitan banks that you're referencing. So, but it would be very interesting to kind of look at that issue in a little bit more depth. With respect to sovereign guarantees, China does have an organization called China Sure that backs China Safe, but that backs some of these loans. But I mean, what they tend to say when you ask them about kind of the risk associated with lending in some of these countries is that they're mitigating this risk by arranging commodity-backed loans, and be it oil or some other sort of commodity that they send to China in exchange for capital. So it's that tends to be, whenever you ask that very direct question that you did ask, that tends to be the response that you get from Chinese scholars.
I'd like to thank the Institute of East Asian Studies for hosting this, and the Center for Latin American Studies also. There will be a video of this up on the website of the Center for Latin American Studies at clas.berkeley.edu. And I have three very brief things, or actually two very brief things to mention. First, this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of it. I very much want to thank everyone for being here, and look forward to future conversations about these themes. And most important of all, I was told there is going to be a small reception right outside here right now. So thank you all for coming.